half hour. I want to welcome back to the program from the WMU Political Science Department, Professor Peter Wielhouwer. Good morning.
Good morning, Richard.
Well, it's been a busy few weeks with a number of items. We'll see if we can get to them all, not the least of which was the State of the Union this week. And
yes,
the President's last State of the Union address. Anything stand out to you in that, or was this typical for a president on his way out?
Well, I think what we saw is less of the typical laundry list that often is included in the State of the Union address, and more of making the case that his administration, the years of his administration, have been years of recovery and success, both domestically, economically, and globally. So I think that he's really trying to frame perhaps history's evaluation of his administration.
It was just reported there a second ago about having taken the road, Omaha and Louisiana, talking about a broken political system. Is that typical for a president who's just about done?
Well, I think that he's pretty candid, and in fact, in a lot of ways, our system is broken. It may not be irreparable, of course, but I think that there are parts of the system where the ability of the branches to work together to make policy and to come to consensus certainly is much more difficult to accomplish now than it has been in decades past.
Seems so. Is that as a result of this president in particular, or is that just where we were headed?
I think we were headed this way. When political scientists look at the trends of these things over time, in fact, beginning in the 1980s, 1990s, you started to see members of Congress really starting to pull apart. Democrats became more uniformly liberal. Republicans became more uniformly conservative. And then trying to get those parties to work together to produce policy at all is difficult. And then the president in the mix, it just creates an environment that is much more conflict-based than we had seen, for example, in the 70s and the 80s. You know, we kick into the 90s and the 2000s, and there is more conflict and more what we call polarization.
Will we swing back from that, do you think?
I think probably we will. I mean, these things do tend to go in cycles over time, but we're living through this now, and it seems very ripe and very challenging for people who do see a positive role for government or who want to see government do things or get out of things. To try to get anything accomplished is what is just extremely challenging now. I suspect that we'll find more consensus, especially if we end up electing a president whose party also controls Congress. Then more opportunities will present themselves.
Yeah, and that the way the pendulum has been swinging, though, when that happens, then the other party tends to get the majority in the next off-year election.
Right, so there's a limited time frame. When we looked at President Obama's first term, this is the situation we faced. And he was able to have some productive time in that and accomplish some of his policy goals. But in 2010, then the Republicans took over control of the House again, and that pretty much stopped. So we do see these things go according to the uniformity of control in the government.
Professor Peter Wielhouwer with us on WBCK here in the first half hour of the 8 o'clock stretch on Thursday. In a moment, we'll talk about executive orders. The president has used it a lot. What was the original intent in that? We'll discuss that. Straight party ticket in Michigan and some other things coming up. Professor Peter Wielhouwer, WMU PoliSci Department, is with us now. So the executive order, President Obama has issued them fairly readily, and, you know, we all know the politics of that. Republicans decry it. Some even call it illegal. Democrats say, that's leadership, baby. Right there. They won't work with him, so he takes the bull by the horns. What is the executive order really about, and what is it meant to do?
So at its core, when Congress passes a law, oftentimes they assign to a federal agency the responsibility of implementing that law. And what that means is that the president, as the head of the bureaucracy, the head of the executive branch, he then is given the authority to make changes to manage that agency. So what an executive order is nearly all the time is it's an order from the president on how business is to be conducted and how policy is to be pursued within that agency and within the scope of authority that Congress has granted. So what President Obama does is he says, all right, within the scope of what the federal government does and where I have authority, what can I do to achieve my policy goals? So one big example last year was he set out new energy efficiency guidelines for federal agencies in which they try to pursue more green energy, make their buildings more efficient. And the scope of that is buildings that are owned by the federal government, because those are the buildings over which the president has authority to do anything. Mm-hmm. So it's limited in that sense, but that's the reason that executive orders exist.
So have other presidents invoked it as much as Obama?
Actually, I was looking at these data, and University of California, Santa Barbara has a Center for the Study of the Presidency, and they have documented every single executive order over the course of the Republic, the ones that can be documented. And what we see is that President Obama actually doesn't really use the executive orders any more than previous Democratic presidents. And in fact, he's lower in his totals, and he's lower in his averages per year than most other presidents. What we see where the conflict comes in is that Republicans really object to it when it's a Democratic president. Democrats object to it when it's a Republican president. So we were hearing the exact same story when George Bush was president. And in fact, one of the things that Barack Obama said when he was running for president is that President Bush issues too many executive orders trying to consolidate power into the presidency, and that Obama said that he was going to stop that. But in fact, it's an important tool that the president has for accomplishing more influence within the government that when Congress grants that to the president.
And you know, whether or not this is excessive, I guess, is in the eye of the beholder, but frequent use of the executive order, does that go against what would be the typical process by which things get done? In other words, what the Founding Fathers intended, do you think?
Well, it's hard to say exactly. I don't think that they envisioned the president doing things exactly like this. Mm-hmm. But the fact of the matter is that we have a system of checks and balances where Congress and president are in competition for power and influence over the policies. And one of the things that goes along with that is this notion of separation of powers, that Congress can't implement all the policies for the laws that it passes, so it gives authority to the president naturally as the head of the bureaucracy to manage the bureaucracy. And so it cuts both ways. To a certain extent, the president usurps some power that the Congress perhaps thinks it has. On the other hand, he is actually only doing what Congress allows him to do, so that if Congress really objected to the president's issuing executive orders, then the laws that they pass would simply need to have fewer opportunities for the president to manage certain areas.
Interesting. All right, we're talking with Peter Wielhouwer, WMU professor of political science. 8:20, back in just a second with more. WBCK, every now and then we get the chance to talk with Professor Peter Wielhouwer, and that guy there would say, and so we do when we get the chance. All right, and he's with us now from the PoliSci department at WMU. So, kind of an interesting watch on the presidential race at this point. I guess it's an opportunity to talk about that a little bit. The news on the Democratic side this week is that Bernie's gaining on Hillary.
Yeah, he is in the two big primary states, the first one in Iowa and also in New Hampshire. He is making significant inroads. National polls among Democrats, he's still well below Ms. Clinton, but certainly in those two states, and Iowa was a bit of a surprise too. I think that the Democrats really did not expect that, but he's showing remarkable strength. His fundraising is very strong. He has a lot of small donors, and that means a lot. That suggests a very strong grassroots level of support within the Democratic caucus. That was one of the things that really helped Barack Obama, if you recall, back in 2008, was his ability to get a lot of people to donate a little bit of money, a little bit at a time, made a huge difference in his campaign spending. Well,
and the way he talks, people don't care about all this name-calling and emails and things. They want to know how they're going to pay for college and so on, and he says that's what is bolstering his campaign. Do you see it that way?
Yeah, actually, I do. I think that he is expressing the frustration of especially young people, but to a broader extent, people on the farther left side of the Democratic base, that they're frustrated with politics as usual. They're frustrated with politicians who they perceive as being part of the problem, and certainly Secretary Clinton's history within the Obama administration, her history as a Senate, as well as some difficult votes, and has really provided a basis for Bernie Sanders to say, listen, I've been pretty consistent on these things over the years, and more cohesive in terms of the way that I've articulated and supported these democratic and these liberal values.
On the other side of that, here's Trump still kicking up dust wherever he goes.
So it's the same story, but a very different verse.
Yeah, right.
Donald Trump is picking up on a lot of frustrations on the conservative side of the spectrum, frustrations with the establishment, frustrations with business as usual, typical politicians. But his folks are older. They're more blue-collar workers, and they're much more likely to be frustrated with perhaps the Obama administration specifically, government overreach, the burden of taxes, and so forth, as well as frustration with the system. And but Trump's solution is, I haven't done this before, but I've done other things successfully before. Trust me.
Right.
And so it's a little bit of a different kind of populist message, but they're both populist messages on either side of the aisle.
Does any one of these three, Clinton, Sanders, Trump, have the ability to bring two very opposing sides together and work together?
That's a great question. If you think about bringing Republicans and Democrats together to work, I'm hard pressed to see any of those three do that. In fact, most of the Republicans, I'm hard pressed to do that. I think it'd be difficult to see somebody like a Ted Cruz do that, who's in second place, generally nationally. Some of the more moderate Republicans, such as John Kasich or Jeb Bush, they possibly could do that. Hillary Clinton ideologically could do it, but I think that she's a lightning rod, and I think that Republicans just would be loath to cooperate with her just on principle, because they just hate Hillary.
Yeah, and it seems that, and I don't know if this is new or not, but it seems like it is. When Obama was elected, there was a solidarity among Republicans to say, we're going to give him a hard time, and we presume that would continue, right?
Yeah, well, we would think that would continue, and certainly you heard that from people like Mitch McConnell, who's the majority leader in the Senate. He essentially said that my job here is to make Obama a one-term president, and statements like that. But in the current era, as we alluded to earlier, this polarized context in Washington is not unique to the Obama administration. We certainly saw it in the Bush administration, with the sole exception of the unity that everybody felt after 9/11.
Boy, time's running out. I want to get to this straight party ticket thing quickly. The eliminating of the straight party ticket option in Michigan, Republicans say, hey, look, this is a way for us to make sure we know who we're voting for, we know something about them and be informed. Democrats say it's just a Republican engineering to try and lengthen the lines in districts where they tend to skew Democrat and then thus frustrate them and they don't vote.
I actually don't think it's about lengthening the lines. When you think about the way we look at our election ballots, most people vote for the offices at the top of the ballot, which are the highest level offices, governor, senator, and so forth. But then you think about all those little offices down at the bottom of the ballot, or on the other pages of the ballot. Those are called down ballot offices.
Right.
And when you eliminate the straight ticket vote, essentially what happens is you make it harder for people to make informed decisions about those down ballot votes. And so oftentimes people just stop voting for those down ballot offices. We see a significant amount of what we call drop off in the number of votes cast there. So to a certain extent, the Republicans, their argument is right. But on the other hand, the Democrats are correct in terms of saying that this is what the impact is going to be. But just as I know we're running out of time, but I would just suggest that on 538.com, there's a very interesting article in November about how both Democrats and Republicans try to shape who gets to vote for how many offices, and their preferences are primarily based on what's going to be good for their parties and their candidates. I encourage folks to go look at that article.
538.com.